and thanks for tuning in to the Path 11 podcast. I am your host, April Hanna. At the Path 11 podcast, we are here trying to deliver leading-edge research on consciousness, healing, and metaphysics. And just like you, we are trying to answer the big questions about life. Who are we? Why are we here? And what is our purpose? We hope by listening to our podcast, it will make each day you live on Earth a little easier to understand. And now for today's podcast. Hey, Path 11 podcast listeners. I was wondering if you have checked out our Patreon page yet. If not, you can go to path11podcast.com and click on the Patreon button. And for just $1 donation, you can have access to some private things that we were putting up on the Patreon page, like my MBT experience that I took in Tennessee with Tom Campbell. I did an audio journal for about the 4 days explaining what had happened to me during my binaural beat sessions. It was amazing, impacted my life, changed my life, but we are only going to allow our Patreon supporters access to the 4 days of my journal entry. And it is a Food for Thought Friday, so that is where you can find it. You can donate just $1 to listen to it. If you like the content that we have up on Patreon, you can continue to keep your subscription for $1 a month. Otherwise, you can cancel it at any time. So head on over to path11podcast.com and click on the button that says Patreon. I have a quick announcement before we get to our guest today on the Path 11 podcast, and I wanted to remind you that you can head on over to our website, path11productions.com, and you're going to see Afterlife Awareness Conference. I'd like you to click on that link, and I want you to know that we now have a membership to the directory of all the videos from this live stream event that we filmed back in November of 2018. There were some amazing speakers at this conference, which include William Buhlman from the Monroe Institute, Suzanne Northrup, and Thomas John, who were amazing psychic mediums. You get a chance to see them reading the audience and the people validating what they were saying. Another one of my favorites was Suzanne Geisman, who is also a medium and intuitive counselor, and told a fantastic account and story of a soul that had passed away but left all of these clues and came back to communicate with people. Monica Williams Murphy, she is a doctor and had a great presentation about conscious dying in the clinical setting. Terry Daniel and Linda Fitch also had amazing workshops that they presented as well. So I'd like you guys to head on over path11productions.com and click on Afterlife Conference. Check out and see all the videos that we have available to you for this membership that we have going on. And now on to our show. Well, I'd like to welcome our guest today, Stephen Sakellarios, who is going to be talking to us about reincarnation, past lives, and I'm very excited to speak with him today because in reading his book, it's an ebook, Matthew Franklin Whittier in his own words, it is pretty fascinating to look at what he documented to be a potential past life that he found out that he was in. So, Stephen, welcome to the Path 11 podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, so I know that you were working on a documentary back, what was it? Back in 1997 is when it
When I started working on it. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that documentary was called In Another Life, Reincarnation in America. So I would love to hear a little bit more about how that came to be and maybe where your story began in getting very interested with reincarnation and past lives.
Well, it goes back to when I was a little bit out of high school and started studying Eastern mysticism. And, I went on with that for quite some years. So that's what I understood of reincarnation. I didn't know that anybody was actually researching it. But in 1997, I had my own little video production company, and I had started with photography as a serious hobby and moved into video and television. And I knew that when people took their ideal of what they wanted to do creatively and turned it into a job to earn money with it, that they tended to lose the creative part of it. And I didn't want to do that. So I said, well, I'll have a project that goes along parallel with my paid work. And because I'd studied reincarnation as part of Eastern mysticism, I decided to do this documentary on reincarnation. And I was really, actually, I woke up one morning and just realized that's what it was going to be about. So we don't know what happens at night, who we talk to or who talks to us or, any of those things. People say that you have, meetings and so on. But anyway, I woke up and I knew that was my topic. And that's how it got started. And I developed the website the next year and things pretty much took off. And I realized that, oh my gosh, there'd been all kinds of research done on that topic, and basically of two types. There's scientific research, and then there's research that I would call that proves it to a legal standard, beyond a reasonable doubt. So they really kind of run parallel, and they don't talk to each other. And then there's past life therapy, which I also learned about. So there's really three streams that I put together in my documentary, and my idea was to do an overview of to kind of take the temperature of America and say, okay, how are people in America finding out about reincarnation? So, I go by method in the documentary. This is one way people are finding out about it, through past life therapy. Another way is through scientific research. Another way is people that research their own cases, like myself.
Right. Wonderful. Now, I know that it was broadcast on a PBS affiliate in Denver, Colorado, but as our listeners are listening to you describe it, is there still an avenue for people to be able to view this documentary?
Sure. It's on YouTube and a couple other venues. They can find it on my website. So if they go to the main page and scroll down a little bit past my books, they'll see the links to watch it online.
All right, great. Now, reincarnation is like a second language to me, but I don't want to assume that our listeners, although our listeners love all of these topics, we may have a listener that is very new to what the concept of reincarnation is. So can you kind of talk a little bit and educate our listeners about what Eastern mysticism says about reincarnation? What does it actually mean? So for those who maybe are just hearing this term for the first time.
Well, it's a good point, and we have to distinguish between what Eastern mysticism says and what the research is saying and what the New Age is saying, because they're not exactly the same. Eastern mysticism says that that the real part of a person is the soul, the bottom line. It would be like the aquifer, a well in the aquifer. Well, the aquifer is the real person, and the well is all the stuff that's added on top. So they would say that the soul really doesn't reincarnate. The soul just is. Okay, so what actually reincarnates is what's called the subtle body or the astral body, the energy body. Takes on a physical body and drops it, takes on a physical body and drops it. And in between, it's in the astral realm or the bardo realm, the other side. And then it takes on another body, comes down, comes into the womb at roughly 21 weeks, according to one authority. And begins the whole process. So it's a cyclical business, it's a wave. In other words, like everything else is waves. This is also a wave, and it's cyclical, and it's not a linear view of life. It's a cyclical or cyclical view of life. So then you get into why it's done and what is remembered and what isn't, and what survives into the next reincarnation and what actually has died, and there's my own study informed some of these things in terms of specifically what is it about you that's the same and what has changed, So there's a lot of implications, but basically that's it. It's a cyclical process where the energy body takes on or goes into a physical body and then leaves it again and comes back.
All right. Now, let's go into what you have found with your research. So I liked what you said just there. What parts of us stay the same and what parts of us do change? What have you found? Well,
first off, I want to say that I didn't just find it or imply it. I proved it,
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make that really clear. I really, I took the best reincarnation cases I'd studied and their methods, and I applied it to myself. So I tried to be as rigorous as I could. I tried to shoot down all my own speculations and conclusions, as best I could, so what I've got left is pretty solid. So what I found was that the emotions are the same. We are now all operating on emotions that come from the past. We're not operating only on our present life emotions. So whatever you react to, whatever person, whatever situation, whatever belief, whatever group you encounter, you're reacting with all of your past life emotions in real time. This is the first thing I found out. And the past life therapists know this. They call it the affect bridge or the emotion bridge. That's how they get people into a past life. They're saying, going for the emotions. What do you feel? What are you feeling? And bang, they're in it, So the second thing is I found that the higher mind is the same. And this goes along with what I'd learned in Eastern mysticism, which is that what's called the mental body or causal body changes very, very slowly over many incarnations. So chances are, if you're looking, I think I'm looking back 2 incarnations with the one I studied. I think there's one in between I couldn't find. So if it's only been 2 incarnations, but basically the same higher mind. And by higher mind, I mean your values, the way your mind works, what you think is humorous, your attitudes, that part of the mind that's not specific to your life experience. So then in between that is the physical body, which obviously is going to be different, but it's not that different. It's usually about 85% similar in all the cases I've seen. Similar look about the person, And
would that be if they were male or female, or are you saying
pretty much?
85%?
Yeah, pretty much. And what I understand, this didn't come out of my study, but what I gather is that most people will go several incarnations in one sex and then they'll flip over and go several incarnations in the other. So at that flip point, you're probably going to look pretty similar. Now, if you get like 7 or 8 incarnations into your male or female series, you might start looking different at that point. I don't know. That's conjecture. That doesn't relate to my findings. And then then there's what I would call the physical personality, which is your identity, your self-image, who you are in this life, meaning, I was born in Long Island, I grew up in Miami, I've spent, time living in the South, and, I had these relationships and this marriage and, whatever. My world that I associate to. So anytime I look at a table or a chair or any object, I associate with my associations from this life, which is why one reason we don't remember the past life. Even if I'm presented with something about my past life, I associate with what I know from this one. So I don't remember it, except when the emotions come through. So if there's strong emotions, if I'm confronted with something, and this happened, I've documented this in my own case. If I'm confronted with something from my past life and there was very powerful emotion around it, the cognitive memories can leak through in flashes. And those flashes stay exactly the same. They're like, split-second glimpses, and they never change. It's always the same, So, that's what doesn't come through except under certain circumstances.
Wow. So that takes my mind to say, well, then is there this imprint on our consciousness? Like if you're saying like the strong emotions are always related from past life emotions, then it seems like that there's some sort of, memory that is held.
I think there's a lot more memory than people think there is. I think we're constantly experiencing past life memories and we don't realize it because we think it's all part of this life. But for example, in past life therapy, there's phobias. A person's desperately afraid of water and afraid of being caught in a tight space. And there's no reason in this life for that. Mm-hmm. But it makes perfect sense when you find out what happened in the past life. So you're actually experiencing your past life now, except for that one layer of physical personality, which forms what they call the river of Lethe or the river of forgetfulness, amnesia. It's basically like we have profound amnesia on that level.
And the amnesia, I'm thinking, has to happen or else we really wouldn't be able to function fully in this incarnation.
Yeah, and I found it tricky, especially what I found is the more I immersed myself. See, I found a great number of pieces of literature that I wrote in my past life, like 1,500 published pieces I ended up finding. So, and a lot of this is essays and some of it is travelogue, so it's basically like a public diary. So I've got this huge pile of writing that I did in my past life. So, in a way, I've got past life memory, but I have it mostly vicariously. I forget where I was going with that. I was going somewhere with it and I lost, so maybe you can trigger my memory. But
yeah, no, that's fine. But I would really like us now to get into how you began to investigate and research your past life. And you ended up, writing your book about it and documenting it. And it's a fascinating story. So I'd like you to kind of begin and take our listeners through this journey that you went through.
Oh, boy. Well, here we go. Okay. So let's see. The question is where to pick it up. In 2003, when I released my documentary, I did a print interview, an online interview, where she sent me the questions and I answered the questions and I sent them back. So in the course of that interview, I said that, let's see, I've got it quoted here. This is in fall of 2003. And this, by the way, is preserved on archive.org. And this is important because I'm trying to prove these things, right? So this printed interview was preserved by the Wayback Machine of archive.org, which means I couldn't have tampered with it. It shows the date and it's there. So I was asked if I remembered any of my past lives and how they might have influenced my work. And this was my answer. I do think that several of my past lives have been very influential in my work. I have, through intuition, glimpses, and educated guesswork, identified a few lives I feel pretty sure of, and a number of others I have hints of. Then I said, I've been a writer, connected, I think, with the Romantic poets, for example. Not any of the famous ones as near as I can tell, but I think I knew some of them personally and ascribed to their overall philosophy, for better or worse. So I had felt that all my life, So I went back to childhood even when I first encountered some of these Romantic poets and had these, very strong feelings about them. And then I forgot about it. Now, I had also had a psychic reading in which with a woman named Patricia Kobler in Atlanta, who had told me that she thought I had been a female writer. And if I remember correctly, it was on the West Coast in about 1930, something like that. So that's the one I was looking for. And every once in a while, I get on the internet and just kind of casually look for, historical female writers, names that I might recognize. And I didn't really hit anything till finally I hit one, Sarah Orne Jewett, who was kind of toward the later part of the 19th century, and she was connected with the Romantic writers. And I got on the website, and I said, well, I'm not this person, but it seems really familiar. So I had videotaped a fellow named Jeff Keane, who some of your listeners might be familiar with. He has his own reincarnation case as a Civil War general. And he had contacted me when I first started my website. And he came and I videotaped him. I was the first to ever present him publicly. He went on to become relatively famous in reincarnation circles. But I was friends with him, and I knew that he had a tremendous knack for synchronicity, so that when I was around him, these incredible synchronicities would just happen. And I said, well, maybe he would know why this is significant, why I feel like this is familiar, this website for Sarah Orne Jewett. And your listeners can find it. It's a text project website for Sarah Orne Jewett. Well, about half an hour later, and this was, by the way, May of 2005, or late April or early May of 2005. So he shot me back an email maybe half an hour later, and he said, I've got the quote from his email here. So let's see, I tried to do a little preparation here. He says, as if guided, I went to main contents and then to portraits, then to the very bottom name, Matthew Franklin Whittier, clicked on it and said, bingo, looked at the picture and said to myself, he looks a bit like Steve, sent along a file, and so forth and so on. So he found it. So then I clicked on that and I looked at it, and what I've got is an etching of a man in like his late 40s or middle 40s, I think it was. And we know that he was friends with Sarah Orne Jewett because he's there at the bottom of her list of social circle. And we know that he was the brother of the famous poet John Greenleaf Whittier. And we know he's an author, and that is all we know about him. And I looked in the eyes of that three-quarter facing portrait, and I knew that was me. Bang. A sense of recognition. I said, that's me. And he does look about 85% like me. I've got a comparison picture just like I made for Jeff, And it went from there. And then I got a book by John Greenleaf Whittier that is not by him. It's his letters, and his official biographer had written a little introduction, which, of course, when they are in the childhood, that's also Matthew's childhood. And some of those things started to seem familiar. And then I got, there's only one biography of Matthew Franklin Whittier. It's a student thesis, 1941. And I read that, and some of it seemed familiar, some of it didn't. I wasn't sure. But his writings, there were like 5 samples of his writings, and that was strongly familiar. And one of the first things I knew when I saw that writing was the feeling that he embedded a great deal of secret autobiography in those stories. They're humorous stories, but he embedded a lot of his own personal history in it as code. When I say code, I don't mean cryptography. I mean, like analogies and, hidden references and things. And that turned out to be true with Belzon. But that's how I got started with it. But that was 2004, 2005. So the next thing I was going to go into there, we could talk about the method, but I wanted to take a break for a second, and give you a chance to give some input. But then there was a whole method as to how I did it.
Yeah, I would definitely love to hear the method, because I think that's, that's going to be, I think, the part where people are going to want to engage in their own, in thinking about what feels familiar to them in a past life, and then how do I actually apply this method. But I have to say, when I was going through your book, one of the things that I found to be pretty striking was the resemblance of the picture. As here I was looking at you, and I was looking at the picture, and I was like, wow, there really is a resemblance. Like, I'm not just making this up with my eyes. I mean, even the shape of the nose, the spacing of the eyes, I was like, wow.
And the vibe too. I mean, you have to look into the soul of a person as much as you can, and it's also you can see that too. And the same with Jeff Keane. Jeff Keane's past life image is even closer than mine. I mean, it's absolutely, pardon the expression, it's a dead ringer. It's amazing. But yeah, mine, and they're all like this. This is the thing. When I get into a case that I'm convinced is genuine, not because of that, but because of what I'm going to get into in terms of method, they're all like that. Almost all of them.
Yeah. So I think that, definitely let's go into the method, because some people might be listening and say, okay, well, what's the big deal? So he was reading stuff and, stuff felt familiar to him, but what does that mean? And how does that actually prove that you were this person in a past life?
Well, that's the meat of the thing. And as you know, my book is very long, and I have another sequel on top of it. So, and I'll get into why they're so long in a minute. Part of it is this, that I wanted to really prove it, not just, not just infer it. Now, a lot of people have done reincarnation comparisons where they rely primarily on synchronicities and coincidences. They say that, I started school on April 11th, and this person started school on April 11th. And, I married somebody named Jane, and they married somebody named Jane, and there is something to that. But it's not what I call the real evidence. It's kind of the icing on the cake. Mm-hmm. And now, when you want to look at real evidence, I had 2 sources. Again, the same sources that went into my documentary. There's Dr. Ian Stevenson's work and his colleagues who studied young children who remembered a lot of specific details about their past life without any way of having known it. Now, there's an objection, a skeptical objection called cryptomnesia, which means false memories. And that means that, say, I'm under hypnosis, for example, and I'm remembering a life about the 1600s and being in a war. But I watched then somebody realizes, I watched a movie about that 10 years ago. The same thing. And some of the things that were in the movies were coming up in the regression. And, there's cases like that where there's a big question thrown around it because they could have gotten it from a book or they could have gotten it from a movie. See, so if you're really serious about proving a past life, you've got to get around that objection. You've got to defeat it. So Dr. Stevenson cut out the whole business. He cut out hypnosis for the most part, although he used it some, which I personally know because I've corresponded with him. He was supposed to be in my documentary, by the way, and he pulled out. So that's another story. I think he pulled out because there were other elements in it that he didn't want to be associated with. But you've got to eliminate cryptomnesia or false memory, and he did it by just focusing on children that didn't have any experiences. They hadn't watched any movies. These are children in rural villages in India, to start with, and they hadn't watched any movies. They hadn't read any books. Nobody told them, about the guy that used to run a video store, or used to, use some kind of milk machine or something, and he was shot in the back of the head, and and he lived here, and he had sister and brother and mother and everybody, and the kid's remembering all this stuff, and not only that, the kid has a birthmark that corresponds to where the guy was shot. This is Dr. Stevenson's research, and anybody that's interested in reincarnation, if they haven't studied Dr. Ian Stevenson, they need to study him. But then, so I borrowed on his methods. What he wants is statements from children which could be verified, which they could not possibly have known, which then were verified after the statements were made. So you see how it is. They've got to be as many as possible and as specific as possible. So we want specific, idiosyncratic statements like the money was buried under the door, okay? Or I marked the letter H on the door, or, my wife was afraid of snakes, or something specific, and the kid remembers it. He had no way of knowing. They go back, they verify it after his statements. And there's no perfect case, because there's always some little caveat, some little, wiggle room somewhere, but he's got like 250 really strong cases like that, And when the time you get up to that point, like Jeff Keane says, what would be proof to you? That's a quote from him,
Right.
And that's the question. What would be, how high are you going to keep raising the bar until you say uncle? See? so, and that's out of our control. We can't force somebody, but we come pretty close. So I took that method, and then there were people who had used who had proven their own cases to what I call the legal standard, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. And the two that I patterned my research after was Captain Robert Snow, who at one time was the head of homicide investigation for the city of Indianapolis. So this guy knew research. He knew how to be rigorous, because he's presenting cases for the court to try to win a court case, and he knew his stuff. So he went in as a skeptic because somebody dared him. And he went under hypnosis, and he went into full immersion, which I never did. I wasn't a good hypnotic subject. I did use 2 hypnotic sessions. I wasn't really a good subject. But he sat in the chair for half an hour feeling uncomfortable, and all of a sudden, bang, he was in full immersion, experiencing this past life. I think he experienced 3. One of them he was able to prove. I think it was 28 points, finally, that matched, because he found the guy's diaries after he'd had this experience. He was trying to disprove it. And by gosh, all of those comments that he made that could be verified were all verified in the diary. See, so he had to, because he's a rigorous guy. He admitted I was wrong. It was real. So that's the first one. The second one is a woman named Angela Grubbs, who I discovered, I think, through Carol Bowman's forum, if I'm not mistaken. Carol Bowman's another leading figure in this field. And she happened to be in Atlanta where I was, and I videotaped an interview with her. She was, and I believe is, a research attorney, and she is professionally trained to research, legal cases, and she researched her own past life memories in the same way, and she proved it also. This was a woman that lived in the early 1900s, if I remember correctly. She has a book out as well. So I took, these are professional researchers, plus Dr. Stevenson, who is a psychiatrist. I took their methods and applied it to my own case. And so now we get into what I did. This isn't easy because I'm researching my own case. So how do you do that? So what I do is I write down and document and email, because I had somebody helping me, everything that I could possibly remember, every reaction that I had, every feeling I had, every impression I had. I documented it with a date. And then I started digging into the history and exposing myself and being exposed to elements of Matthew Franklin Whittier's life. So I'll give an example. I knew that he had contributed to a Boston paper called the Chronotype, which was a radical anti-slavery Boston paper. And this is the best of my memory is how this came about. So I ran across one of the editors, one of the early editors. George Bradburn was the fellow's name, and he was an abolitionist and a Unitarian minister, and he had been hired as the editor of this paper an editor for a certain part of its life. And I believe the picture's in profile, and when I looked at it on online, on Google, I guess it was. And I had an experience, and the experience was that I knew him, but it was such a close friendship that in my mind's eye, I could see him turn and smile at me, and I knew exactly what it would look like, which told me that this must have been a really close friend. That's what I felt, a very close friend. So then I started researching him. I found that there was a memorial his wife had written after his death, and as I read down, I found that he was close friends with Matthew's brother. But that didn't do it for me, because this was a close personal friend, not like a friend of my brother's, Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, maybe I'd messed up here. I'd overstated the case or something, or I'm imagining these emotions, or whatever, which I don't think people do actually imagine emotions based on something they've heard. Skeptics might pull that card out, but I don't buy it. This was like, I know this guy, and I know when he'd smile, like what came to me was like a warm hearth on a cold day. His smile. That's the phrase that popped into my mind. So then I read down further, and it turned out that they'd both worked for about 14 years in the same department of the Boston Custom House. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't absolutely prove that they had that close a friendship, because you don't necessarily get that close to a coworker, but it means it's extremely likely, plausible, entirely plausible.
Right.
So that's just one example of how this thing would happen. I'd expose myself to something, I'd have a feeling, and then I'd go back and see whether I could prove it in the historical record. What happened was, and why the book is so darn long, two reasons. One is that I kept finding stuff. The more I dug, the more I found, and it went on and on and on. I found stuff on eBay. I found references, and I'd go check the reference, and that would take me to a bunch of his writing in a whole nother publication, and then there'd be a little reference, and that would take me to another one, and it went on and on like that for years. It wasn't really finished until like maybe a year ago. So and the other thing that made it long is that can I get into this, or do you want to?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing that made it long was that, as I said, I found about 1,500 of Matthew's published works, most of which were in different newspapers, mostly literary newspapers, starting from age 14 up until he was in his late 60s. In 1875 was the last one I found. The first one I found was 1827. So he was a child prodigy, and he started very young. His first publications were in something called the New England Galaxy in Boston. And he was like 14 and 15 when he was contributing to that thing, and very sophisticated stuff. But anyway, he published almost everything anonymously, and he would pick up a pseudonym at the drop of a hat. Most people would take one pseudonym or maybe two, and that was it. Matthew would constantly pick him up because he was in hiding. And the main reason he was in hiding, aside from his own personality, was that he was doing dangerous anti-slavery work. And he didn't dare let anybody figure out who he was. Wow. So he had to stay undercover. And I found out a lot he was basically an anti-slavery agent, undercover reporter. And I found out a lot about that too. But people would take his best anonymous work and claim it. And then when finding that out, I would have to disprove that claim. And that's hard. Even today, like there's a fellow that supposedly wrote the movie Avatar, which he didn't get credit for, and he went to court over it and he lost, even though he had pretty strong evidence, So now I'm trying to disprove things that happened 150 years ago, claims from 150 years ago. And it's really tough, but I did it, So, but here's where I lose credibility entirely. And, if I didn't get any results, I have to honestly say I didn't get any results. If I get astounding results, I have to honestly say I got astounding results. I didn't start with this stuff. I wasn't really looking for it, But here's what I said. I've got this down in my blog. In my blog on May 31st, 2006, I added something that just had come to me. I said, here's something that might be useful as evidence. I have a strong feeling that I had some impact or influence on Charles Dickens' writing of A Christmas Carol as Matthew Whittier, but I have seen absolutely no evidence in that regard. That's 2006, before I even started researching it. I proved it, at least to the legal standard, that Matthew and his first wife, Abby, who was also a literary prodigy, wrote that original and not Charles Dickens. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I proved that Edgar Allan Poe didn't write The Raven. Matthew did, after Abby's death in 1841. So those two claims are so outrageous that I just lose credibility instantly when I report that.
Mm-hmm.
But the Charles Dickens one, I can prove that Dickens couldn't possibly have written it. I can come pretty close to proving that Matthew and Abby were the original authors. When it comes to The Raven, I can flat out prove that Poe didn't write it.
And how do you prove that? I mean, did you find writings of it when you were searching and, for all the stuff that he did have published, or how do you prove it?
What I found, first of all, I found that Poe couldn't possibly have written it. And that's a series of negative proofs, which some people have questioned a few of these things. After Poe published that, he published it in 1845, and in 1846 he wrote an essay for Graham's magazine, Philadelphia, called an essay on composition, I think it's called, and he tried to explain how he wrote The Raven, and I don't know, can we say the BS word? I'll use BS. All professors know when you're BSing on an essay, and some of them will put a big red F on it. That's exactly what he was doing there. If you look at it, and there's a few people that have commented on it, it's obviously and manifestly BS. This is a grief poem, and it's a poem with occult overtones about a grief crisis. A faith crisis, excuse me. It's a faith crisis poem of somebody who was sincerely grieving. And Poe's explanation was that it was an intellectual exercise. He just talks about style, So that's one side of it. But I can definitely prove that on multiple occasions, Matthew encoded protests in his writing to Poe, saying that protesting that he'd stolen it. So that's what I can prove. I can prove that Matthew Franklin Whittier on numerous occasions charged Poe with having stolen it. What I don't have, of course, is Poe admitting it, which you're never going to get, Right. But I can also show that there was a back and forth between them. There had to have been a back and forth in correspondence where Matthew would charge him and Poe would just blow him off, Mm-hmm. But I have some examples. I'm not just going to stop there. Let me... Okay, so there's many of these. So there's, don't take this in isolation now. There's a bunch of them. But first off, I found that Matthew was writing as the review editor for the New York Tribune, when The Raven was published in New York. So Matthew was there on site. Matthew was a reviewer for a major New York City newspaper at the same time that Poe was also a reviewer for a New York City newspaper. They were like a block away from each other, basically. And then I had to get into that because that whole series is claimed for Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller was the literary editor of the New York Tribune during this period. She is credited with all of the reviews and essays and reports that Matthew wrote during that year and a half. So I had to take that away from Margaret Fuller before I could look at this evidence for Poe. And they all know each other. I mean, Fuller and Poe were like friends, and so this is a tight little group here. But Matthew had written with the star or asterisk, which is all of these pieces are signed with a big asterisk. Matthew had used that years ago, since 1831, 1832, he'd used asterisk to write reviews. He used it all his life. And I figured out what it meant. Abby was a mystic. She was an occultist and a mystic, and she believed that the stars were living, and she believed that the stars at least represented souls in heaven, and she thought of herself and Matthew as twin stars. This is his soulmate, his first wife. So after she died, he would sign everything with the one star, the one remaining star. So that's what it meant to him. And this brings up the point that with these people that claim these writings that are really Matthew's, Matthew has a deep backstory. And these guys don't have any backstory. So that's one way you can tell that he's the real author and they aren't, because once I know his life, I know why he used these things, why he wrote them, what he was referring to. They all have this deep backstory to them. So that's the deep backstory to the asterisk. It's his half of the star of the soulmate couple. So now, after Poe publishes The Raven under his name, it was actually published twice, right about at the same time. One of them was published under blank Quarles. It's a reference to Francis Quarles, a poet from the 1600s, 17th century poet, a very deeply religious poet. There's no reason why Poe would identify with this guy, because Poe wasn't religious, and Quarles's poetry is all deeply faith-based. But Matthew was, and Abby was. So before The Raven comes out, in one of Matthew's reviews, he praises a poem by Francis Quarles, who's fairly obscure. But right before The Raven comes out, signed Quarles, we've got Matthew under the asterisk praising a poem by Francis Quarles. So that's one little piece, okay? So then the other thing you have to know is that Matthew appears to have been the real author of La Fontaine's Fables, translated into English, published the year Abby died in 1841. They came out under the name of Elijah Wright. Elijah Wright was the editor of the Boston Chronotype. They apparently were friends before then. What I remember is that this was Matthew's homework when Abby was teaching him French. Abby was half French. French was spoken in their home. She was his tutor, even though she was 4 years younger. She was teaching him French, excuse me, and she had him translate these fables as homework. And they decided to let Elijah Wright publish them. But Abby was very strong about she's a Victorian, she didn't want anybody to know that she had written it or helped write it. She encouraged Matthew to stay anonymous, because that would avoid the pitfall of fame and egotism, see? So they published it anonymously, but Matthew knew these fables backwards and forwards. So now he reviews, or is asked to review, or forced to review by the editor, Poe's compilation. Poe published The Raven and Other Poems, a compilation. Matthew knew damn well it wasn't his poem. He responded in a few ways, but one of the ways he responded was to say the following, and I'm taking it a little out of context. Matthew says, "We have taken people at their word, and while rejoicing that women could bear neglect without feeling mean pique, and that authors, rising above self-love, could show candor about their works and magnanimously meet both justice and injustice, we have been rudely awakened from our dream and found that Chanticleer, who crowed so bravely, showed himself at last but a dunghill fowl." Well, I know what Chanticleer is. Chanticleer is a rooster, and it's a reference to this fable. Now, the fables of La Fontaine are Aesop's fables translated in verse in French, and then Matthew translated them back into English. So here it's only two stanzas. Here's the poem. The Cock and the Pearl. A cock scratched up one day a pearl of purest ray, which to a jeweler he bore. I think it fine, he said, but yet a crumb of bread to me were worth a great deal more. That's the first stanza. Now check out the second stanza. So did a dunce inherit a manuscript of merit, which to a publisher he bore. 'Tis good, said he, I'm told, yet any coin of gold to me were worth a great deal more. The only way you know that is I know that Matthew puts these hidden references in there. He'll quote something, and you're supposed to look up the quote, okay? Or he'll quote something and leave a gap in the middle, and you're supposed to find out what's in the gap. He did this over and over. I've got I don't know how many examples. This is the way he did his coded messages in his work. So what he did here was to make this passing reference to Chanticleer and the dunghill fowl, meaning that that's Poe. And then you're supposed to look up the fable. And the second stanza of the fable says it specifically that he stole the manuscript and sold it. But I've got 20. I counted them before, a couple days ago in preparation for the interview. There's like 20 clues pointing to this. And some of them are that's the strongest.
Yeah, it's like the never-ending scavenger hunt.
Yeah, that one I call my smoking gun.
So let me ask you. So you did all of this research. Like I said, it seems like the never-ending scavenger hunt. It led you on this adventure. And what do you think? Like the whole purpose is in this incarnation to have found out about this past life, and how has it been helpful?
That's a great question. First off, there's the personal side of it. Again, our emotions don't disappear. They're still the same. So I have Matthew's emotions. and I wanted this thing straightened out, because I last count 15 or 16 different people claimed Matthew's work, and some of them got famous with it to varying degrees. Dickens and Poe got outrageously famous, but the other ones, got fame to a certain level. And I think that Matthew and Abby both had the Victorian idea that one should avoid fame because it leads to pride, spiritual pride, and that one is much better. And this was not just them. A lot of people in that era published anonymously, but most of them published with, like I said, just one pseudonym so you could figure out who it was, But they didn't, and their stuff got stolen a lot. And I feel like he wanted to set that right because he realized it was a mistake. And here's why I feel it was a mistake, and it's kind of hard to explain. First off, if you look into Charles Dickens' character, he was not a good person. Okay, and the same with Poe. Poe, everybody knew he wasn't a good person, but Dickens, everybody thought he was wonderful, especially because of A Christmas Carol. When you take a spiritual, a channeled work, an inspired work, and you attribute it to a scoundrel, it does two things. First off, it somehow or other reduces the spiritual value of the thing. Secondly, it makes people open to anything the guy puts out. Now because Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, we'll just absorb anything he wrote, as being of the same quality. That opens people up to, negative influences. And likewise with Poe. If Poe wrote The Raven, then we'll just swallow all this other stuff that's poisonous, So it's not a good idea to let anybody else, of lower spiritual vibration claim your work for that reason. For another reason, it's just wrong, So there's a selfish part of it. So that's that side of it. But this is the perfect storm as far as proving reincarnation, because not too many years ago, you may have heard of the Leininger case, or some of your listeners may be familiar with, I think it's James Leininger case, a little boy who remembered that he was a World War II airplane pilot, and he could prove it. They take him to the museum. He sees the plane. He knows what kind of Corsair that he used to fly. And his mommy says, James, look at the bombs. He says, that's not a bomb, Mommy. That's a drop tank. I don't know what a drop tank, but he knew. Right. You know what I'm saying? He proved it on a number of points. So, but that came out. It came out. I forget the venue it came out in, but it was like mainstream television. And then it disappeared. People forgot about it. Well, that's the way things are nowadays. Any outrageous thing can show up and 2 days later it's gone. Like, the world is like big science fiction entertainment now. Nobody believes anything anymore, or cares. But this case is different, because if it is really proven that Matthew Franklin Whittier and his wife was really the co-authors of A Christmas Carol, and if it is proven that Matthew Franklin Whittier was the real author of The Raven, the thing won't go away. And it cannot be separated from reincarnation proof. It's so integral, and I'm first. If anybody else claims this stuff, I'm first, and I'll show up and I say, wait a minute, I have this in my book. I've been saying this for 10 years, So they might be able to ignore me, but it's not going to be easy. That means that if this is an earth-shaking, 8.5 magnitude earthquake in the literary world, if not anywhere else. These two things, because there have been people that have spent their whole careers, believing that, and studying Dickens and studying Poe and believing these things. If that gets blown, reincarnation comes in with it, and reincarnation cannot be kicked out. So I feel like all of that was planned before I came in, and I'm the front man,
Right.
So that's another significance of it.
Do you also find, with your findings of this evidence, are you a little more emotionally settled in this lifetime, even though there's still work to be done to really, have people, I guess, take your research and, I don't know, I don't want to say that people aren't believing it per se, but, if I'm thinking about what is the benefit of going through all of this work for this incarnation, if we're always operating, with our emotions from past life emotions. Was there an emotion that was healed in this lifetime with you discovering this, making, these announcements and uncovering this information?
Well, now we're into the just to stick with the personal side of it. It's difficult. It's unsettling. It's emotionally difficult because things that I had put to rest, a century and a half ago are now back. Awoken. You're awakening. Dragons that might have been better left asleep. So I find myself very frustrated at the lack of reaction to my work. But I've got all of Matthew's emotions about his work being neglected, about him being neglected also. See, so not only am I pissed about what's going on now, I'm pissed about what happened before. So, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for everybody, So that's that side of it. But I did gain a great deal of insight about myself. Things that I didn't understand about my childhood, what I was struggling with in my childhood, what I was struggling with as a young man, and, patterns. I see the patterns very clearly now that now it all makes sense. So that side of it has been a great help. But in terms of being settled or calmed down or anything, no, it's been opposite.
Okay. Well, I'd like you to give our listeners your website and also where they can find your ebook so they have the opportunity to take this journey with you and to go a little bit more into the depth of the research that you've done.
Sure. The website is www.ial.goldthread.com, like a needle and thread, GOLDTHREAD.com. The books are all listed right up at the top. So they're easy to access. They're on Amazon.com, and they're also on my own personal online store. So very easy to find. And then if you scroll down into the text, you'll find the link for the documentary as well.
Wonderful. And if our listeners start to go into their own search, and if they have any questions, are you open to answering any questions by email?
Sure. Yeah, I'm fine with that. There's also, I don't have the URL in front of me, but if you go to my website and look for the articles page, there's a link to the articles page. There is up near the top an article about my method, and that will give you lots of ideas on how you could start your own search. And there's certain things not to do. I mean, you want to get all of your memories and impressions down, dated, and even preserved with some other, reliable person, if at all possible. Before you start researching, because if you start finding answers before you've documented that you had the memory before that, then you can prove it to yourself. Here's the thing that you can prove to yourself, but then if you want to prove it to anybody else, you've got to use a method like this.
Right, exactly. Well, Stephen, thank you so much. This was a really incredible interview. Very, very interesting. I'm sure a lot of our listeners, including myself, want to try this method now and maybe delving a little bit more into our own past lives with some caution. Just hearing about, as you said, that it can still bring up some stuff or allow those old emotions to continue to resurface. But it definitely sounds like it was an amazing, journey and still continues to be. So thank you so much for being a guest on the Path 11 podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Path 11 podcast today. I hope you all enjoyed this show. And if you haven't checked out our Patreon page, I'd like you to do so because we are going to start putting some content over there that is only for our Patreon subscribers. You can get content for as little as donating $1 a month, and it could just be a one-time donation. We have other freebies over there that you can get depending upon how much you would like to donate. And again, it could be a one-time donation, or you can continue to keep your subscription on a monthly basis at that donation level. But I just put my MBT immersive experience, which was a four-day intensive meditation training in Tennessee with physicist Tom Campbell. I was listening to binaural beats, going to altered states of consciousness, having out-of-body experiences and life-changing experiences that I was able to bring back for myself, for my clients, for my friends. That was just out of this world. So if you would like to listen to that, I'd like you to head on over to path11podcast.com. You're going to see an orange button that says Patreon. Become a Patreon today, and you can have access to that podcast. And I would like to remind you to head on over to path11productions.com and check out the membership that we have for the Afterlife Awareness Conference. We have over 25 hours of footage with amazing speakers like William Buhlman, Thomas John, Terry Daniel, Suzanne Geisman, Suzanne Northrup, Linda Fitch, Austin Wells, just a few people to name off that were amazing. These workshops are just so valuable. So I think that you would really enjoy it. It's also a great thing to think about to maybe give the gift to somebody who is struggling with grief. If you are looking for resources, this is a great conference to send people to check out. And thanks again for listening today.